Hello, hello.
Hello, Ezekiel.
How you doing, man?
Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm excellent.
Good.
It's good to talk to you.
You as well.
So I think we'll just get right into this. I mean, I don't really have a structure or anything,
That's quite
but
all right.
I mean, yeah. How's your day been?
Quite well. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yours?
What does a day in the life of Yamsox look like?
Well, I wake up and before my feet touch the ground, I always do a prayer to Mother Earth for giving me this body to use and do higher things with it. And I spend most of my time doing my mantra. With my inhale and exhale, I try to remember the names of God. And what I do during my breathing throughout the day, that changes.
So you're very focused on your breath and how you breathe.
Absolutely.
And how do you so do you think you should force breath, or do you think there's times where you should just let it be? Or what are your thoughts on like meditation and breathing in general?
I think a lot of people might have the impression that conscious breathing means manual breathing, but I think it's just awareness of your breath. Letting it be is a good way that you've described it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I know that there's different breathing methods, right? So like, is there a certain one that you feel like you've mastered, or is there a certain one that you feel like you want to master?
Not in particular. It's more of a natural kind of awareness, just having as long breaths as I can, deep and cyclical.
How long is the cycle for of your breathing?
I think I did time it actually a few days ago. It's something like uh, probably 10 seconds.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Hmm.
And is that all diaphragm, like all on your diaphragm, or is that like how does it come in? Like, does it fill your chest up first and then your diaphragm, or like?
Mm. I found that just filling the stomach up first and then the chest seems to be the most soothing for me.
Mhm.
Tummy breaths.
So do you feel like when you breathe, is it easier to release things, or is it easier to like release certain emotions, or like how do you what's the correlation between your breath and like your emotional state, your mental state, and all that kind of stuff?
Well, the breath is so intimately connected with the nervous system. When you picture someone who is anxious, one of the visuals that might come up is the idea that their breath is hyperventilating, but it goes both ways too. A great way to calm someone who's panicked is to slow their rhythm, and that helps me absolutely too.
And so, I mean, yeah, everyone talks about like slowing down your breathing when you're getting anxious or getting panic attacks. I mean, is that something that you've experienced? And like, do you have like any advice for people that has also go through that as well?
Oh, yeah, I used to have a lot of anxiety, and the simplest thing that helped me was breathing. When I used to have such panic attacks, I found that the first thing to take control over is your breathing and then go from there.
Mhm. Is there like a correlation between willpower and also breath as well? Like, have you found a correlation between that two?
I think you'll often find that before someone makes a real big decision, the first thing they do is take a deep breath.
And so you find yourself, do you take deep breaths before big decisions like that? Are you just constantly
Absolutely.
just doing it?
Yeah, no, I both.
Both. Yeah, you're already taking 10-second breaths, so it's funny. And so one thing that interests me, especially with some things that I've seen with yours, is the science of nothingness.
Yes.
Wondering if you can talk on that, and what does that mean?
Well, I kind of came to the conclusion about nothing in my dormitory at college. was thinking about how, you know, nothing as a word, we use it so freely in a sentence without thinking about it. But if you really place emphasis on this idea of nothingness, then it starts to be a solution to so many big philosophical questions. For example, if you just ask yourself what came before everything, just the simple answer is, well, by definition, nothing. You know, if you had something come before everything, then it would be a part of that everything. So inherently, before everything comes nothing. But that sounds a lot like God to me.
And so this idea of nothingness, right? Like, why do you think people have a problem with maybe emptying themselves and becoming nothing, or having some kind of feeling of emptiness inside of themselves? Like, why do you think there's a resistance towards that?
I suppose we feel like we should become something or someone, and to be no one is an insult in our culture. To be nobody, to feel empty is a negative trait, but you have to come to these adjectives to be able to find spaciousness and openness. These are qualities of that emptiness.
And spaciousness and openness. Can you describe? Is there like different degrees of it? Do you think there's like different periods of your life where you feel spaciousness and openness? Like, what is that like?
Yeah. You know, there's a mathematician who once studied various degrees of nothingness, and he started enumerating them. I'm not well versed in his research, but absolutely you can come to a kind of nothingness and then come to an even deeper kind of nothingness. And I wouldn't know how to describe the differences between them, but I think that emptiness is infinite and there is no bottom of the rabbit hole.
Mhm. Now, is there certain energetic qual? Is there certain like energetic qualities, or like what do you find begins to happen within yourself when you start to experience, that emptiness or that nothingness?
That emptiness, nothingness, spaciousness is all a synonym to me for consciousness. For consciousness is the very space that contains all of it, this experience as a human. So when
Mhm.
we rest in that emptiness, we are abiding within ourself, the very movie screen in which it all takes place, rather than identifying with the thoughts that appear to it.
Yeah. Do you think that everything is kind of a mirror? Like, in order for you to have a kind of moment of self-realization, do you think that maybe you can, or like, what is your take on just consciousness, being the observer and then looking at things and using them as kind of like a mirror to, wake up
Absolutely.
and stuff like that?
Yeah, yeah. Since this nothingness intrinsically cannot be seen, cannot be heard, it is by definition the absence of form, then in order to experience it, we require some other kind of method than direct experience. We rely on the objects of our experience to serve as a reminder that we are witnessing, since we can never observe the observer. Through the observing itself, we are reminded. And in that way, everything does kind of act as a mirror.
And can you talk a little bit about that relationship between like being the object versus the subject, or being the subject being viewed?
When we watch a car drive by, we often don't feel like that's us, which is being driven by. We feel like there is space between the entity that's doing the watching of the car and the car itself. And this is the difference between the subject and the object. The subject is on the seeing side, and the object is on the seen. And when we recognize the distinction, we feel like we don't have to identify so much with our body and our mind, for they too are just like passing cars.
And so there's this thing that I personally have looked at on my journey,
Yes, do
and there's this thing
share.
called apophatic theology. So this is kind of something because we're talking about like nothingness and the object, things like that, object and subject. But I'll read the definition of it. So apophatic theology, also known as negative theology, is a theology that attempts to describe God by negation, to speak of God only in absolute certain terms and to avoid what may not be said. So in Orthodox Christianity, apophatic theology is based on the assumption that God's essence is unknowable or ineffable, and on the recognition of the inadequacy of human language to describe God. So the apophatic tradition in Orthodox is often balanced with cataphatic theology or positive theology and belief in the incarnation through which God has revealed himself in the person of Christ. So what
That's
is your thoughts
beautiful.
on the way of
Yeah,
negation and
I
just
love
that
that.
definition in general?
Absolutely. I find that since we experience the very presence of creation, then in order to understand what came before it, we have to think in terms of absence. And it's a beautiful way to get in communion with that source, to consider a quality that everything has and then negate it. And then that's a quality the source must have had. For example, we might say that everything is changing. Therefore, when we negate that quality and apply it to the source, we find that the source must be changeless. Or here's another one. If everything has qualities of good and bad in it, then the source must be beyond these qualities.
Hmm. And how do people apply kind of negation in their life, right? Maybe they have a busy life. So what does maybe
Mhm.
someone who's a busy person lives in a city, how does negation come into play in each moment
Yeah,
of their life?
practically speaking, it's something that we can do to acquire a kind of detachment from the world. When we understand that the source has qualities which are beyond those in the world, then we begin to feel those qualities as separate from the world. Whereas so many of us are so engaged with going to work, raising a family, it can often tie us to certain identities in the world. But through the practice of negation, we can come to a sense of eternal identity, which is beyond the world.
So kind of like an eternal vision, right? Like seeing things from the end.
Eternity is one of those qualities that the Source has, and therefore you and me and everyone being a soul that is an expression of that Source. When we come into our divine qualities inherited from that, then we find ourselves to be eternal as well.
What do you think of maybe how do I describe this? How do you think the body comes to play in spiritual transformation, right? So when we negate ourselves, for example, we enter into sort of a state of emptiness and negation. We find ourselves in somewhat of a heightened, maybe alert awareness, and we
Mm.
feel energized. We feel one with everything. And so it seems like we're kind of negating the body or kind of distancing ourselves from it. but how can there be, connection to or what's the connection between the body and negation as well?
Yeah. It's important to not ignore the body. The body is our vehicle through which we serve others. And this spaciousness that we come to through a heightened sense of awareness, it transcends the body, but that doesn't mean the body is meaningless. The body is one of the things which is contained by that awareness. And therefore, it's one of the tools we have at our disposal to share love, sincerity, truth, compassion.
So, like as awareness, for example, or you try to make your way towards this awareness, right? How do you begin your path to realizing yourself as this awareness? Because at least when I first started out, right, and I started out with meditation, um, I had to start to very closely observe my thoughts. At least
Mm-hmm.
this is the route that I took. So somewhat in a way of self-observation, where like I would catch my eye thought, start to comment over things, give different labels over things, and I watch it very closely, like you're like a you could say like a predator watching over its prey. Like I
Yeah.
would look super closely, and there gets to a point to where, at least I've noticed that my ego then just stops throwing these constant thoughts because I can see right through them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's kind of the route that I took. But for somebody that's trying to negate and someone that's trying to, realize themselves as this awareness, what are some tools? What are some keys that they can access to um, experience this?
Well, just as you have shared, keeping within your intellect that knowledge that the one thinking is not necessarily I. So, trying to do some positive reframing, which takes this I ness out of the subject. For example, we put so much weight on our sense of self being perfect. If you walk into a room and your body accidentally knocks over a, let's say, a vase and it smashes on the ground, the mind may say, I did this, and so I must clean it up. And there's nothing inherently wrong with phrasing that situation in that way. However, we immediately tie ourselves to this and might feel a negative feeling that arises from it. Other languages often, like Japanese, for example, they don't usually put yourself at the subject of such incidents, and it's an entirely equivalent way of seeing things where they instead rephrase it as, oh, the vase fell down and now it must be cleaned up. The situation hasn't changed. We've just placed I out of the terminology, and you still take accountability for what needs to be done. It's just now your sense of self is unaffected by the circumstance.
So, what other languages have you noticed has a strong identity with the I? And
Mm,
what other cultures have you seen like have
Well, I
the same
don't
thing
know
with
many
Japanese?
languages myself.
Okay.
I don't know how to speak Japanese either. However, this is just something I've picked up from those who do speak Japanese. But
Research,
in
huh?
our culture, English, we certainly always call ourselves I and relate to the objects of our experience.
Yeah, definitely. And so I feel like there's a point to where you observe a lot, to where I mean, you you feel this awareness, right? You feel this deep sense of like maybe peace or gratitude or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a point to where you also disidentify from awareness, or you is there even
Mm-hmm.
can you go even deeper than that, or is there
Mm-hmm.
just you feel this heightened sense of awareness, you feel calm and at peace and one with yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a point to where you can go beyond that?
That's something that the Buddhists try to accomplish with their principle anatman, that you can get to a kind of awareness that's so non-dual that there is no self. There is a witnessing, but no witness. An observing, but no observer. It's not something that I've experienced, so I can't speak on behalf of it. But here goes that I again creeping in. So
Yeah. Sneaky. What's funny is like I mean, where I've learned kind of like non-dual or like kind of like meditative teachings was from like a Christian mystic, and
mm,
yeah, they brought these concepts, and one of the ways in which they described, for example, like um, they call it ego ungluing, where you watch yourself enough, you watch that I thought enough to where it starts to become unglued from your headspace, and what can start
mm,
to happen is that you kind of experience it almost feels like a swarm of flies fly around your head, or it feels like some kind of mask is starting to come off or something like that.
mm.
Um, but have you experienced anything like that, or like what are your thoughts on maybe that term that I mentioned, ego ungluing, or maybe like yeah, maybe a veil coming off of the eyes or something like that.
I like that. Ego ungluing. Um, Actually, in my own path, I found that when I did struggle with deep existential kind of dread and my panic attacks would becoming more severe, I would try to remember that I am not suffering, the suffering is occurring to me. And despite this kind of higher awareness that the mind and the consciousness are distinct, what I actually found to be most helpful was to bring in a sense of duality in a healthy way, where I would call out to whatever is listening. Instead of identifying with the listener, I would externalize that observer as the one who I'm speaking to. And so I'd call out and say that, I'm lost in the suffering. Please pull me from the mire of all this. Maya is that Sanskrit term. And I found that it actually alleviated a lot of the suffering. And so, although I can speak very highly about the non-dual path, I have found that duality is still a extremely valuable part of this experience, and it's not something I have seen as something needed to let go of. In fact, it can be a beautiful expression of that spaciousness itself.
And then like just to be specific, also people that are watching, like what does a non-dual versus dualistic mean? And then also like
Absolutely.
what do you what cultures or what maybe countries do you think this would probably work best in, like non-dual versus having more of a dualistic mindset?
Well, non-dual simply means that there's no distinction between the subject and the object, that you consider truth as one. And so, whatever duality that exists, binary, such as creation and creator, you'd consider as non different. And within your own experience, you'd see the self and the universe as non different. Whereas duality creates a distinction between yourself and the universe, between the creator and creation. And to me, it's not that one belief system is correct and another is incorrect. It's just that they have different utilities depending on the moment. Culturally, the Western world is very much used to duality, that we experience ourselves individually as separate from the world. And in more Eastern traditions, such as Zen Buddhism or Buddhism in general, and different sects of Jainism and Hinduism. There is a non-dual tradition that is very prevalent. Individually, it's up to the practitioner whether they wish to follow the path of non-duality or duality, but they both lead to the same.
I have this question that came up in my head right now, but how do you think? What's your take on transmission of knowledge, right? So if you follow
Mm-hmm.
more of like a Zen path, right? I feel like knowledge would be more transmitted through mind and the development, or just letting go in general. Like I feel like the essence of I feel like a lot of knowledge that you gain is from intuition, from letting go,
Mm-hmm.
from even maybe a master that can kind of intuitively transmit teachings into your consciousness. Whereas, I mean, maybe more on a dualistic perspective, it's like maybe it's more physical, maybe it's more like in a book, you read it, you learn, you get the knowledge of it. But like, what's your knowledge on, or what's your take on the transmission of knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
all that kind of stuff?
In the ancient language that is Sanskrit, there's this beautiful pair of words, aparavidya and paravidya, which separate knowledge into two kinds. There's lower and higher. And lower knowledge is that which has to be sought out to be acquired. You have to go to some master, some teacher, some book, or some course, or some lecture. You're not born with it. So you have to go out, expend effort to gain it. But the reason this is considered lower knowledge is because it's not knowledge that remains with you. Everything that is gained eventually has to be let go of. So even the highest PhD is not something you get to take with you after you're leaving of this body. Whereas higher knowledge is just the reverse. It's something that everyone has, but it gets obfuscated. And so it requires a deconstruction to realize what's been there already. And so the reason that some gurus can seem to transmit knowledge intuitively is not because they are delivering something to you, but showing you what's already inside you, just with consent, deconstructing what's preventing you from realizing the truth already embedded in you.
It's pretty fascinating. Do you feel like you learn that way, or do you feel like you've taken a different route?
I have found that I best relate to knowledge when I can discover it within my own experience.
Yeah. And I mean, do you have a guru yourself, like someone that has taught you many things?
Well, I do look up to this guru, which is known as Jagat Guru Sri Kripaluji Maharaj. However, he did leave his body about a decade or more ago, and he has a foremost disciple known as Swami Mukundananda. And I have been in very brief contact with him, and he kind of explained that with no direct terms that the lineage continues, and so if I wanted I could look up to him as a guru since his guru has left his body, died. So perhaps Swami Mukundananda could fill that role for me.
So what comes to my mind right now is like, I remember having a dream, and this kind of ties into transmission of knowledge. But so in this dream, like it occurred because I was doing a certain practice at the time, which I haven't really done recently, but it was like a standing qigong practice where it's called the grand circle, where you just stand and you allow yourself to breathe into your diaphragm. You'll allow the entire body to relax, and you just stay present, with yourself, and you just wait to, for the dantian to get filled and for that kind of rush of energy to come up. But I had a dream, in which there was like a ladder, if I can recall the exact setting, but I remember climbing up a ladder, and then there's just this guru who had like a bunch of like oil or honey, and as I was
Mm,
climbing up this ladder, then he just poured it over me, and was like kind of got the feeling that I was getting kind of the teaching passed on to me or something,
mm.
or
That's
like if I
beautiful.
kept going, like. But like, have you had any dreams like that, or any like gurus try to teach you or show you things about yourself like that?
I did have one Swami come to me in a dream, and he gave me a business card, and it said Swami something or another. And later that week, when I was out and about, I found one of those sidewalk libraries where you can leave a book, take a book, and I pulled out a book and I opened up randomly through it, and out fell out a ripped page about the shape of a business card with the same name on it. And
Oh wow.
I must confess, I've lost the card and I don't remember what this Swami's name was, but that was one of those moments where I dreamt of such an encounter happening. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, so having or we talked a little about knowledge and kind of transmission of knowledge, like higher knowledge in general. I feel like that has to do with more of realizing yourself as awareness, having this higher intellect. Um, have you found certain practices that, or have you looked into certain practices that also develop your heart, or also like, is there something behind that as well? Is there a distinction between having heightened awareness and then versus being kind of present and conscious in your heart? Or yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. I found that you can develop this heightened sense of awareness, but the question then arises, what are you going to do with it? It's, of course, very affirming to have this spiritual knowledge, but what use is it then to just keep it to yourself? So then that is where the practice of bhakti or seva, devotion and service, come in to then go and share that. And so we open up our mind first as the gateway to our heart, and then expand our heart so we can share it with others.
and what are ways of devotion that you find like just what are just ways of devotion that you commit yourself to?
First and foremost, recognize that that divinity of your awareness is non-different from the divinity of the awareness within everyone that comes across you. So, although you may not get to experience yourself directly, you can experience others. And as others appearing to you, they are that mirror, like we talked about before, but also a manifestation of that source, which is your opportunity to serve.
Yeah, and I want to go to a concept, or at least that I found also happened as I was kind of developing, or this I was developing awareness or whatever. I'm just using this to kind of try to communicate it.
Mm,
But this I was trying to develop my awareness and such. There's this concept called the void, in which
mm,
someone can find themselves as they begin to deconstruct and let go. They find themselves surrendering into this unknown space that can seem endless, that can seem endlessly dark, empty, all that kind of stuff. And it can
mm,
also, I mean, for some people, at least that I've seen, it produces like terror inside of them. Like completely letting go can kind of be something scary. Um, but can you go into that concept, the void? What does that
mm.
mean? And how have you seen it
Shunya,
manifest in people?
the zero, not zero. This void is a glimpse at the source. From nothing, everything arises. From stillness, movement is inspired. From darkness, light transpires. To return to that void is to return to the Akash, the seed-like state of existence. Of course, it can be very bewildering to come to such a nothingness when we feel so attached to somethingness. But it is known that that void is none other than the essence of your very self.
And so, how do you get to a point? Because I've seen different people take different paths towards this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some people do it through contemplation. Like, for example, you can kind of contemplate. So if you sit right now, for example, and you want to take in your experience, right, and you want to look at what's going on, you can kind of start to observe how the space between objects versus objects themselves, how there's a different range of colors, but they all happen within awareness. So you can
Mm-hmm.
kind of like visually kind of take in things and then start to deconstruct it and
Mm-hmm.
feel the separateness and the this yeah the room and how there's objects in it versus spaciousness, and you can kind of contemplate that way. There's obviously in meditation where you can close your eyes and then just go into this, and you're not necessarily looking at things visually, but you feel a deep sense of like, this is kind of where I belong, or this is where I'm going. Some people, when they, I mean, when they go through traumatic stuff, can put them in this sort of state of entering the
Mm-hmm.
void, or maybe death can bring about
Yeah.
getting close to the void. So, what is your? I mean, how have you seen the different ways of, or different paths in which people take to go towards this? And can you kind of describe those ways?
It all has to do with deconstructing what's in front of it. Like you used the term veil a few minutes ago. There is something which is in front of it, and that's all this. And when we do close our eyes in meditation, it might feel like we're just adding another veil in between the light and the witnessing. However, it's not that we're adding anything new by closing our eyes, such that there's something behind. We're really getting rid of the light, and so we're getting a sneak peek at what's behind it. So too, in a more deeper sense, when we fall asleep at night, although we can close our eyes, we can't close our ears, but still we're able to turn away from the experiences of sound while sleeping. And so cars may drive by, people in the house may speak, but you're none the wiser. So there is a deeper kind of pivoting of the senses to turn inward, not so different than when we sleep, we can somehow shun the experiences of the senses through the perception of knowledge and come into a kind of dreamless, sleepless, wakingless fourth state, sometimes known as the state of Turiya, that is total absorption in nothingness. And that's something that happens after, for most people, a long time of meditating. Many people never experience that. I can't say I myself have.
You what are your thoughts on the dark night of the soul? Like, what is that, or and what does that mean?
Hmm. There is a passage in the Bhagavad Gita, that ancient scripture, that says, to the wise, uh, darkness is the day, and daylight is the darkness. Night for the sage is daytime for the ignorant, and nighttime for the ignorant is daytime for the wise. Of course, this isn't a literal statement that enlightened people stay up all night. Nighttime simply means that your sense of identity is in the world, and daytime means to be pulled back such that your sense of identity is in the source, that source of light itself. And to most worldly people, this is a terrifying thought, to have your sense of self stripped away from the world, since we hold on to so many things in the world. To worldly people, that sounds like a kind of death, a kind of nighttime. And I suppose a dark night of the soul, therefore, is when someone comes to awareness of this point, that to be identified with the world, this is true night, true darkness, and you have to find that light.
I like that. One thing that I find too is that sleep can also, I mean, kind of talked about sleep earlier too. Um, Sleep has a very, and your relationship to sleep, right, is a very, it's very important how you relate to sleep. So like, if you view sleep as like, oh, I finally get to like go to sleep like in the day like that, it usually relates to how you're unconscious throughout your day and you're just going through the motions because you would much rather put things off into your sleep rather than be awake and conscious and alert during the daytime. At least that's what
Mm,
I think. But
that's a
I
beautiful
found that,
point.
yeah, I found that as I observe more and as become that witness, or as I become the witness or whatever,
Mm,
um, I feel like I see through sleep and that I can kind of, I don't know, just drift off into, yeah, the source and things like that. Like, sleep is not necessarily something that I am heavily identified with, if that makes sense.
yeah, one of the epithets for Arjuna, the protagonist in the Bhagavad Gita, is one who has conquered sleep. And the Buddha is also described as one who is fully awake while asleep and fully asleep while awake.
Yeah, that's good stuff right there. And so, what are some contemplations, or what are some things that you felt like have transformed your state of consciousness? Like, what do you find is a helpful contemplation for you?
It's helpful to positively reframe negative situations, contemplating on the positive rather than the negative can transform any situation into a blessing. And the more that we feel like this present moment is a blessing, then the more we can be present in it. If we feel like this moment is an obstacle, then of course you're not going to want to be here, be as conscious as you can be. So, a practical technique to be more alert, conscious, here and now is to reframe the events in our life in terms of the positive so that we don't feel so averse to be here now.
Yeah, and what's the thought process behind your like your YouTube channel or like your TikToks? Like, I see you have like different things such as like, what do you call it? Like chakra, like different days are different chakras. Like root chakra Sundays, sacral chakra Mondays. Like, what's your thought process behind that?
Nothing too deep other than that. I feel like it's a good parallel between the 7 days of the week and seven chakras. I'm sure I'm not the first to make this observation, but it's a fun way to make every live stream that I do different with different colored lightings and a different theme of the day. Just gives it a bit of character. That's all.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I mean, what are your favorite things to talk about on live streams just in general? Like, what do you love talking about?
I love talking about whatever I can do to soothe the questioner. I feel like it's one thing to shake someone awake, and it's another thing to bring them breakfast in bed and say, "Good morning, welcome to the day. It's a beautiful time to be alive." Both ways will get the person awake, but the first way is a little bit more brute force, and you'll get the person awake by shaking them, but they'll just want to go to bed right after.
Hmm.
Whereas someone that you gracefully give compassion to, they'll wake up a little more naturally without attachment to go right back to sleep. And analogously, in my live streams, I love to create a comforting space for people to blossom according to their own timeline, rather than trying to give them anything which forces them awake, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, it does. Um, if you can transmit it, like, what is a way? How would you describe awakening, or how would you kind of reveal it to somebody?
I suppose it's not so different than how a flower simply blossoms naturally with the presence of the sun. You'll find that all the petals
Hmm.
on a daisy, they're closed up at nighttime, but when sunlight happens, they naturally open up without even touching. You don't have to go to every daisy in your yard and start pulling at the petals. Just shining a light is all it takes, and it does it itself. The opening. So too, awakening is something that I feel like is not something that needs to be transmitted as it is, just shining whatever light is already within you, and the flower, the aspirant, does the rest naturally themselves.
Hmm. What's your thoughts on, like, what do you call it, mandalas, or like, I don't know, the lotus flower and things like that? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have one on my wall just besides this tapestry of space, and it's beautiful how often I catch myself just kind of absorbed into it. It's a great catch of your mind, I think, to have a symbol with you to remind you of presence. When our mind is drifting, it's good to have something that catches it, especially symbolically.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked too much into it, but like, what is like the significance of, like, maybe the different patterns in the mandalas and things like that? Like, how does the way that it looks like maybe affect
Mm.
you subconsciously or something like that?
Well, of course, geometrically, that's highly rotationally symmetric. You could rotate it by a little, just a few degrees, and everything would line up on itself. So there's so much happening radially, it all spirals out, and it pulls your attention one pointedly onto a center. And that's so symbolic. That's not so different than the process of meditation, where we have all these thoughts spiraling around us, and we're trying to make our thoughts one pointed, pull ourselves to the jewel at the center, the witness.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And so, I mean, are you into, like star signs or anything like that, or like, do you observe the patterns of the stars as well? Do you think there's something symbolic behind that? I mean, I'm looking at your stars right now. They're back as your thing, so I'm thinking maybe there's something behind that, or why you have that up there.
Well, this was a gift from my parents when I went to university and I lived in the dormitory. Something to put on my wall to keep me dreaming of big things, I think. I've
Yeah.
always found myself staring into space.
Mhm. And I mean, do you think that's a practice though? Like, just staring into space? Do you think there's some kind of effect it does? Because I know people stargazing, for example. Like, is there anything behind that, or what are your thoughts on, like, stargazing or stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it's no coincidence that the background of this podcast too is a starscape. And
Yeah, yeah,
more
yeah.
so than that, I have had many moments in which I was looking upon the stars and filled with moments of revelation. I mean, to be able to just try to comprehend the vastness of space really helps minimize the ego. That's for sure.
Definitely. Do you think we come from the stars, though?
Well, we are made of stardust.
And what exactly do you think that would mean? Like, if someone's made out of stardust, right? Like, do you think there's a certain vibration they give off, or does that have to play into maybe the way that someone's uh, role in society is, or does it get that deep, or is it just it's just you fit a stardust?
I think it is a beautiful point that before our sun existed, there was another star that lived its whole lifetime and it blew up, and our bodies are made up of the remnants of that star. And so, in some way, all of us are from the same place, then, that we all share a common source. The molecules, atoms, particles, energy in our body. Well, I'm sure that many of my particles have rubbed up against yours in the previous star that went supernova. And that's a nice thought to think of how we all really come from the same place.
Yeah, definitely. And so what are your thoughts on manifestation?
hmm You know, we have a kind of bank account with the universe where we can make deposits with doing good things and make withdrawals by asking for things. But if you really want to manifest things, you know, ask the universe to give you nothing, and from that nothingness, everything arises.
And so is there a certain, because I don't know, there's a lot of techniques out there. Would you just simplify it by just saying that, or is there, how else would you describe manifestation? Is there a certain technique that can also describe it in another way?
I would picture this thought experiment. Imagine a soccer field, and you went out to the soccer field and you started digging a hole. Eventually, with that hole now in the soccer field, it's only natural that the soccer ball will find its way into that hole at some point, just at the movement of the ball throughout time. Things tend to find their lowest energy state, and it takes a lot less energy to put a ball in a hole than it does to take something out of a hole. So too, manifestation. To create something in your life, you first must have the space for it. And so holding space for something is a great way to kind of beckon the presence to fill that absence at some point.
And are these like masculine and feminine principles that also are in play?
Well, in my experience, the masculine and feminine refer to inward and outward, that things that take you inward are considered the masculine, divine masculine, and things that express outwardly, that's the divine feminine.
So yeah, so in breath, that's masculine, and then out breath would be feminine.
That's correct.
That's cool. And then is that how you balance those energies, by having a certain way of breathing? Or like, is there a way to balance your energies like that?
Precisely. There is another quote from the Bhagavad Gita that talks about renouncing the in breath into the out breath and the out breath into the in breath. Our outward breath is all to do with releasing, and our inward breath is all to do with accepting. So, although the breath in this case is only a symbol of something more metaphorical. Physically equalizing the inward and outward breath is a great way to come in touch with the spiritual breath of releasing and accepting.
Hmm. And I feel like coming to a close here. Maybe is there maybe one other topic that you'd like to cover real quick, or is there anything that you'd like to leave people with in general?
Well, I would love to extend my gratitude to you for sharing this space with me and for hosting it for so many other beautiful souls, I imagine. I'm very blessed to be here, and I thank you deeply for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And where can people find you, by the way?
I go by Yamsox, Yamsox, on all my platforms, and my link tree, linktr.ee/Yamsox, has a link to everything that I do, in case viewers wanted to find out.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing the wisdom and just the knowledge that you have. And
My pleasure,
yeah.
Ezekiel.
And let's end this right here.